because I derived a lot of these slides today from my doctoral dissertation defense, I didn't add a lot of color. So yeah, I've been fascinated with leadership issues ever since I became a manager and a director back, well, many of you were probably still in high school, maybe a couple of you weren't. And was always fascinated on how people respond to certain leadership styles and so forth. And it wasn't until I got after college and went to a leadership training on Long Island that GE ran for many, many years, that I ran into something called situational leadership. And some of you may recall that. It emerged in the late 60s from a couple of researchers out of, can I say Ohio State in here? Okay. Hersey and Blanchard, or Blanchard and Hersey, depending on which articles you've read. And they developed something called situational leadership. And I really grasped onto that because it seemed to be something that managers and people who were involved in teams and so forth could grapple with very, very readily, very quickly, and apply it into their environment. And so after many years in leadership roles, I found myself going through Anderson, pursuing my graduate work there. And one of our first classes, in management, I did a research paper on Hersey and Blanchard, and I came across one of his researchers, holds a PhD in research in leadership, a guy by the name of Zigarmi, Drea Zigarmi. Well, turns out Drea Zigarmi lives in Southern California, close to where my father-in-law lives. So this is how all these things come together. So I went to Blanchard's organization, met Drea, not knowing him, but met him because Ken wasn't there, Ken Blanchard, after having been across town to meet with Hersey, because they separated. Hersey and Blanchard separated 20, 30 years ago and went their separate ways, though still pursuing situational leadership. Zigarmi, along with a couple of others, Lyles and Fowler, developed something called contextual leadership. I became fascinated with that, and so long story short, I decided to follow that research path to see what was being done with their concept and their construct on leadership. Because you know why? Leadership is still the #1 research topic in business literature. There's more popular press done about leadership, there's more academic research done about leadership, and yet we still seem to struggle with what is leadership about and how do we do a better job of it. So Hersey and Blanchard came up with this idea we can have a prescriptive model that will work, and there's this gap between what the academy is doing in the way of study and what we're doing as practice and applied leadership. And basically Zigarmi and company came up with, I think they deny this, but I'm pretty convinced looking at the seeds of their theory. It's a prescriptive model that says there are 5 basic practices to leadership. And you can read those, but prepare, envision, initiate, assess, and respond. And I think what they've added to it is the idea of contexts. How do we take these 5 practices and look at the different contexts? And in my own study, I said, what needs to be done here, if their theory is correct, then we need to look someplace where that theory is being put into practice in training, and we need to start out and look at the area of self-leadership. So that's ultimately what I've done. And basically the idea is we as practitioners, we propose how this thing works best from experience. The academics propose from theory, right? And so there's always this gap between the practical and the scholarship, and I ask myself the question, could my study and research into this arena that the Zigarmi and company have proposed help move leadership practice in the field the next step? So I'll go to, I'm going to jump several slides each time. I'm not going to take you through all these. As I did the background research for this, it seems like these were still open issues. What is the broad understanding of the whole idea of leadership, are there cross-cultural aspects? Are there common things that we can do in leadership that will have bearing as we work with a more and more diverse workforce? How does communication take part in all this? And where does the direction of efficiency in research and teaching need to go? So there was a number of things, but ultimately I came down as Bennis, those of you who read anything in business literature, and so on, how can we develop competencies that are going to further the mission, motivation, the adaptation, and trust, as well as developing others in our organizations? So I felt like, well, this was a good area of research to go into, and the question was, well, was this being done anywhere? Nice book, sold several copies, and the fact is there is a group called Catholic Leadership Institute out in Philadelphia that took this material and turned it into training material. They took all 5 contexts, developed a very involved training prescriptive model around Zigarmi's model and prescription, and began to implement this by training Catholic priests initially. Then they moved from training priests into the laity. And so I saw an opportunity to gather some data. Nobody had done any research on this at all, so I was the first person to get a chance to research A, this methodology of training, and B, what is the outcome of that. So one of the things I ran into that I had to think through was, first of all, this was going to have to be a quasi-experimental design, but I wanted it to be as robust as possible. Why would it be quasi-experimental? Because, first of all, I have a self-selected group. I can't randomly select the participants. They are selecting. First of all, they're not representative of a very large population, right? Most Catholic priests, at least as far as we know, still tend to be male, for example. And so, that's going to limit some of the validity of this, but I still wanted to be able to say that I applied all the rigor I possibly could, and we'll see how we get there. I then realized that I was going to have a comparison group. I was going to have treatment groups, which in fact were also non-equivalent besides being self-selected. And I had to figure out a way to do pre-treatment and post-treatment measures with the training as the intervention, all right? So I have a group coming in that's had no training, supposedly, and I have a treatment, and then I have a post-treatment event. And so also, was this model going to allow me to, if I wanted to extend it into a longitudinal model where I could do further testing, sequenced out 6 months or a year, 18 months, 24 months, to see if there's latency in the training process. And so I decided to embrace, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Solomon 4-group design. It's actually the most robust design that can be used in education and the social sciences in terms of trying to remove some of the various biases that are associated with typical pre-test, post-test kinds of models. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I'll just leave it at that. We'll discuss. And it is an excellent model, but there are some interesting challenges to that model, and that is obviously you need a larger N, and the fact is you're not randomizing. So I knew that, but I still felt it would remove some of the biases and it would provide at least with more validity. The next thing I needed to do was to try to see if I could, rather than trying to develop an instrument of my own, I wanted to see if I could find an instrument, because remember, I'm looking at self-leadership, right? That first context. That's the first training that goes on with the Catholic Leadership Institute. Was there a chance that I could find an instrument that measured self-leadership? Now the challenge is I had to figure out if I could break this model, this instrument down into also helping me understand the various steps that are required in the training. So I picked the Revised Self-Leadership Questionnaire. It is, has a long history. It's been validated several times, and 2 leading people that research in the area of self-leadership are Houghton and Neck, and so I used their instrument. So here's how we set up the model. We had training going on nationally, and I took an 18-month period, and we set up the instructions for the moderators that were doing the training, and so the participants would get a packet of materials, and this is important to this discussion, get a packet of materials preliminarily before they showed up for the first day. Then they would be introduced further into the model. Then they would have the specific training for this first step. So I would give them a test, say I, but the moderators would give them a test before they had the training for self-leadership. Then they would give them a post-test after this day-long training. Now, one of the challenges to what the Catholic Leadership Institute has done is their entire training process takes 18 months. Now, in practice, in the field, with a team of managers, you see that, you can see where that could be a challenge, right? I mean, 3 days, every 3 months, you go to training over an 18-month period. To get your leadership team to commit to that is probably a challenge. I knew that, but remember, I'm trying to figure out, does the training have any impact? And so I use this RSLQ as a model, and then we're going to jump over here to just give you a sense of the descriptive statistics. So basically, I was able to collect 192 surveys from 6 cohorts, and I had 139 unique subjects. I have to tell you, I had to stop. I was going to, I had a heart attack in the middle of this. I've only got 2 minutes left of my 15. Already? Wow. So you don't need to read it. Let me just jump down here to, very quickly to the Solomon example, because one of the things I feel there are, and I know that's many too small numbers, I would just point you to this other handout here. Why use the Solomon model? And we'll just quickly review that, and then I'll tell you that the results. But basically, as you can see, don't worry about all these tests. There are 8 tests that are given, or 8 analyses that are given between all these various cohorts for each one of my hypotheses, of which there were 6. And remember, there were 6 groups, and then there's 8 tests. So you've got a lot of stuff going on here. But what you're trying to do is that first test is try to determine were there any impacts to the training, and the second thing is trying to take care of that if there was any kind of randomization, which I did randomize the cohorts. I could randomize those. Remember, I only had 6 cohorts. So, and you can read down through here. You know, did the pre-test have an effect? Were there any confounding variables? If you read down by test 5. So we're able to determine lots of things by using this Solomon group to help supposedly weed out, to say, all right, because one of the challenges for leadership training is, frankly, anytime we see any kind of results in training, it's hard to substantiate where it came from. And the upshot of all this is, even applying all this myself, was, lo and behold, we were able to validate the RSLQ mattered, but what happens is, basically, we also noted that there was no real implication that after all the training, people were saying in exit surveys, oh, the training helped me, but there was no changes, no significant changes with the RSLQ on any of these 4 or 5 steps or within the overall scores. Now, what I got from that was a number of things. One is, I think that there's a lot of pre-event influence going on just by the materials that are being handed out in advance, even though we're saying we're not training and we're getting a pure untrained sample in the pre-test event. You see, I mean, I'm sending you material, you have an interest in leadership, and so you're going to say you did really well, but did we influence it enough for response? So some of you who've never ran into anything may find this interesting, like this, something called response shift bias. And back in 1999, as a professor out of University of Georgia, a guy by the name of Rose, R-O-H-S. I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around this, but saying you're better off doing a post-test event after training and doing a if-then kind of thing. Where were you before you came in here, and how do you feel about it now? And so basically, I've sat down, had training, I do a post-test here's my scores, but I'm also saying, do you feel like you learn more and know more now than what you knew before you walked in, as opposed to having a pre-test, post-test? This gentleman claims that that's a valid way to find out results for, as he said, for training, for leadership, skill development, et cetera. I have a question about that myself, but I had several people who were in my defense and said, wow, we've never heard about this, and they wanted to run down the rabbit trail and see if that might lend some validity to leadership training. Challenge is, it's hard to prove, and maybe that's one of the reasons that we still see so much literature out there, still trying to find that elusive, can we really measure this accurately? Is there really a key answer that we can find and implement? I think this is valuable in terms of helping. I love the contextual model. I've used situational leadership my whole career. It seems to work, but there again, can we prove it? No. Any questions? Yes, sir. Yes. Oh, yes, sir.
So the mode was 5 years. So the average, experience of the priest.
Yes.
Increased it for 5 years.
Yes.
So is it possible, because they were cloistered, okay? So is it possible that the values have been so formed and solidified after 5 years that trying to change the leadership style, or what they thought about leadership inside of a course simply?
Well, that's interesting, because they do a satisfaction survey. They didn't use an instrument like this, and they say, like 60% of the respondents will say, we learned a whole lot and we're much better leaders now. It's just that using the instrument at the self-leadership level is saying, well, no, we can't prove that. You're saying that, and so they're coming out with the attitude, yes, I did improve. And so is perception reality, but reality, when we test it, doesn't show up. And by the way, most of these, and I didn't get into the data, if they're called a pastor, within the Catholic Church, if you're a pastor, you are the leader of a parish. So even you're not cloistered, so you're working within a group. Many of these priests also had come from other professions before they got into the priesthood. But good question, thank you. Yes, sir, Michael.
I just wonder if further reflection is going to cause them to have more of a change in their behavior. I'm wondering if you measure this further out, if you're going to see a different sort of result as to whether you see it right after the training, if you give them.
All right. Oh no. Right. And that was the plan. The plan was we'd do the post-test right after the training, and then 6 months later, do a subsequent post-test to see if.
Not 6 months later. Did you read the Wall Street Journal?
Well, yes, not
Did you see the
religion.
column by Eva Moskowitz today?
No, I did not.
Teachers, and how just getting teachers to get students to physically show that they're paying attention greatly increases their listening and their test scores and so on and so forth. And she mentioned how that takes time.
Interesting.
To get teachers used to kids.
That's right.
No, you're gonna.
Right.
Oh,
That's
I'm
interesting.
listening. No, you're not.
Oh.
Getting them to change their behavior takes time. It takes practice. It takes reflection.
Well, and I think that maybe, and I didn't, the Zigarmi model was really reduced to a book and a couple of papers, and the CLI picked it up and brought Zigarmi in to help write the curriculum. And it's the curriculum itself sits on a shelf this wide, and so it's a very intense. And all I did was look at that first slice, because one of the things I contended was that if you can't lead self, you sure as heck can't start leading in these other contexts, right? And so I felt like that was the obvious place to start, was at the self-leadership. I was surprised we didn't see, I was very surprised. But then again, you go back, as I said, you look at the other literature, especially situational leadership has probably been put into practice in more businesses. We talk a lot about things like transformational and transactional and servant leadership, but those things are not always reduced to a prescriptive model. It says, well, if you do this, that will happen. And situational leadership is very much that way.